I think we're going to start and then we'll let people catch up as they want to. So, without being too distracted by all the just few people in the waiting room, alerts that keep jumping up. Hello and welcome to the first tea break of this year. Thank you all for taking a bit of time out on this most intense and moving day of the year. I mean, of course, Ash Wednesday, which could be awkward if you bought lots of chocolates for someone. But anyway, so we're going to be talking today about the suburbs, partly about suburban audiences, but also partly about why we'd want to talk about them and what that means. My name is Oliver Mantell. I'm the Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency, and for audio description purposes, I'm a white male, blonde hair-ish. It's been a long dark winter, but it's still vaguely blonde, with a blurred background, because it's one thing letting you read my bookshelves, but reading my parents seems a little unfair. So that's me, and I'm being joined by my colleague Jackie. So Jackie, if you want to do a quick hello.
Sure. Hello everyone. My name's Jackie. For audio description purposes, I'm in my 50s. My pronouns are she, her. I have purplish hair and purple glasses, and today I'm wearing a grey jumper.
Smashing. So that's us. So I'll talk for a bit, and then Jackie will talk sense in response. And without more ado, let's crack on. So the suburbs. Why are we even talking about them? In some ways, it's a strange sort of tension between being a topic that's so obvious it's barely worth talking about, and also so neglected it feels like we really need to bring it to the surface, which is a really strange tension I think we often find around the suburbs and suburban audiences. So I'm going to mention really two particular things about why we want to talk about them before saying something about a couple of particular audiences that we find in the suburbs and go from there. So the first thing, oh sorry, I should have said there are captions available at the bottom if you want them. I noticed someone's already found them, but if you want them, that's what we have. Partly, they are a really substantial part of population, a part of cultural audiences, and increasingly so. On the first point, depending how you count the suburbs, because it's a fascinatingly slippery and ambiguous term, not least because you get interesting blurring between American ideas of suburbs and UK ideas of suburbs and the history of suburbs and what counts as a suburb and so forth. But depending how you count it, about 80% of the UK population live in the suburbs. So in that sense, we talk about suburban audiences because that's audiences, that's like most people. If we try and zoom in a little bit and say, well, there's a few segments that more than others in audience spectrum are suburban, we might say, well, there's Dormitory Dependables and Trips and Treats. We'll talk about them a bit more in a bit. But also, on one of the higher engaged groups, Commuterland Culturebuffs, Commuterland, bit of a clue, that's obviously quite commutability, but also up our street, one of the lower engaged segments. Between those lot, that's still over half the population and 58% of audiences. So that's a big group. We're just particularly today going to zoom in on these two, Dormitory Dependables and Trips and Treats, which you see here, it's about 30% of the population. It's about 33%, or a third to its friends, of the audiences. So both very substantial and on average slightly overrepresented, albeit that's because one of them is and one of them isn't. And again, we'll come back to that. But it's a big group, it's a big chunk of the population. We see them popping up in profiles for all sorts of art forms, all sorts of activities, in substantial numbers. And often people are a little bit surprised when, to see quite how many of these middle engaged groups they have. So again, that's kind of worth bearing in mind. But in particular, it's worth talking about them now because they're not just a big group, they're also becoming more significant, becoming more important as a group. So this chart here is looking on the left to right axis, the proportion of the overall audience we see in audience answers who are in each of these groups in the pre-COVID period. So basically, further right you are, higher chunk of the audience. So Commuterland Culturebuffs, it's a big group, it's really highly engaged, it's right out on the right-hand side. Dormitory Dependables, though, are a little bit, they're a bit higher engaged than average, and they're a really, really big group. So they're the next highest one. And Trips and Treats comes in next as being, still quite a big group, relatively well engaged. And so there are some groups that do themselves engage relatively frequently. Experience seekers, metroculturals, the other two orange ones there. But because they're just not such a big group, we don't see them in the same total volume. So these groups are actually really important in terms of the overall makeup of the volume of the audience, because they combine that kind of thing of being quite likely to attend and being big. So that's that dimension. So that's why they're important in that sense. The other dimension is how post-COVID audiences compare to pre-COVID audiences. And here you see the dotted line is kind of the average of how each segment is or isn't engaging compared to before. And both of these groups are above that average. So essentially they're becoming a bigger proportion of audiences as we move into as we move on from the pandemic. And indeed, they were also growing in the pre-pandemic period. So it's kind of continuing a trend that's been running for quite a few years. So for that reason, essentially, these two are the ones that are top right of this chart as being big to start with and growing, and therefore growing relatively and therefore quite important. That's the kind of pragmatic reason. There's lots of them, they matter more. But also, I want to sort of take a slightly less purely pragmatic view, say sort of why on principle we should care about. So partly, it's because it's where people are. There are loads of them. There's really big groups. They're really significant. We should be looking to include the wide population with cultural activities. It shouldn't just be about small minorities who happen to engage. So it's where the audiences are, but also to a substantial extent it's where artists are, both where they are and where they've come from. So for all that we often hear time and again when people talk about the suburbs in terms of culture, they're described as being, it's all the same and it's boring and it's conventional and it's not cultural. It's cut off from where culture happens. All that kind of thing, and just none of that is really true. They're very varied. There's lots of creative activity happening, and loads of the artists, even that talk about various places being relatively conventional, are themselves coming from those places. So, like to pick obvious ones, people like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Elton John, David Bowie, loads of different art forms you could go into. The Hampstead Modernists, for those that love their visual arts, you could have Barbara Hepworth and Nicholson and all that. They're literally, their group is named after a suburb, and so on and so on and so on. So actually, loads of British culture, also loads of other culture, has come out of suburbs. So to some extent, what's happening when people are going to cultural events elsewhere is that it's the suburbs meeting the suburbs in terms of the audience, the artists, in a place that just happens to be somewhere different. So it seems really weird to be a little bit sniffy about the suburbs because that's where everyone's from. Anyway, I think part of that is linked to an idea that we're used to thinking of culture as a sort of a thing that happens in a place, as opposed to a thing that happens in people. And this is where I start to sort of try not to get too theoretical and practical. Art isn't art unless someone's experiencing it. So it has to be about the person at the point of experiencing the art that is where it actually turns into art at all. And if those people are thinking about it, deciding to go, anticipating it, getting ready for it, all of that stuff in their suburban context, then they go into the centre, they have a live experience amongst lots of other people like themselves. And then when they go home and remember it and more talk to friends about it and re-experience it and whatever, they're also doing it in that environment. It seems slightly strange to think that the only bit of that experience that kind of counts as the valid bit is the bit that happened to happen in the building in the city. Not to mention, of course, there are lots of arts facilities more widely spread, and lots of arts activities happening that don't need those facilities. Lots of kind of everyday participation stuff, lots of kind of people's creativity in their own homes and local communities and local halls and so forth. So it seems sort of slightly strange to kind of treat art as a metropolitan thing. And there's a whole interesting historical background, I think, to why some of that's happened, which I won't dwell on. But I think it's really curious. I think it's something we should actively challenge. I should also flag that the reason there's that picture of the roadside in the middle there, some of you will probably have clocked it already. But there's a famous line by a local band to where I live, saying, you know, you're not from San Francisco, you're from Hunter's Bar. So like you don't come from the big flash global city. You live in the particular suburb of Sheffield, or there's a particular local area. Like own it, like recognize where you're from, live that reality. And I think there's something about the kind of authenticity that comes with that, which I think is really kind of useful as well. Something in the chat, let's just see. How do you define the suburbs? Ah, yes, you've probably clearly noticed like I've managed not to entirely define them. So broadly speaking, and it is a really slippery term, we're talking about places that are connected to or near or accessible in relation to city centres, but which aren't in a city, tends to have slightly lower building densities and lower rise of buildings, etc. But yes, it is a slightly fluid term. It means different things in different places, partly because lots of the places in the UK that are suburbs, some of them will have been towns that got swallowed by bigger cities. That's particularly true of the London fringe, but is also true to a certain extent elsewhere. Will often be purpose-built, but what we have that's different from the US experience of suburbs is much, more restricted land and much stricter planning rules. So you have the green belt basically holding in the suburbs. So you could get kind of, it's the bit that goes out to the green belt that isn't the city centre itself. If that will work as an approximation. But yes. I think one of the things I find interesting about this whole topic is the extent to which the suburbs is an idea as much as it's an actually clear, concrete definition. And I think that's the idea that we kind of need to tilt our lance at a little bit and to the challenge. So there we go. Enough ranting. We'll move on to the next bit. So looking at some particular segments. So I'm just going to pick up on two of these segments that we've mentioned. Oh, I see something else in the chat. Just before thank you. That's brilliant. So just to say that a couple of these segments we're going to start talking about, all within the caveat that, of course, we're talking about big chunks of the population. And one of the things that we're trying to say is that suburban audiences are varied and distinctive and contain people who are super highly engaged as well as people who aren't, who do all sorts of different things. But nonetheless, broadly speaking, within that context, we have these different types of people we can talk of as existing within these areas. There are various different audience spectrum segments, particularly using the second tier, which I think is quite helpful to get you to some suburban audiences that you might want to consider within the suburbs. We'll talk particularly about these two, Dormitory Dependables and Trips and Treats. So very briefly, Dormitory Dependables, suburbanites and small towners, a bit of an interest in heritage, mainstream arts. They tend to be a little bit older on average, tend to be more infrequent arts attenders, have potentially a little bit more money, are more likely to go to things as more like special events and one-offs. They like kind of quite no nonsense communications, but quite sort of formal or kind of quite traditional ways of engaging in terms of event formats. And then you've got your Trips and Treats, who tend to be again quite mainstream tastes and a bit more sort of popular culture and children and family stuff, where there are quite a lot of families within this group. They tend to be more interested in culture as something you do as part of quite a busy, time pressured life, that is, you're trying to do stuff that's fun, that's maybe good for the kids. There is a tendency for them to be much more digitally engaged and active than the Dormitory Dependables, although not necessarily in terms of consumption of culture, but also potentially inclined to do stuff that's a bit hands-on or that's linked to heritage and local history and stuff. And someone very helpfully said, that's probably Megan, that there's much more detail about all the profiles online, including well, I'll say in a sec, but more detailed motivation. But if broadly speaking, these are the two groups we're talking about, let's look at a few other sort of different things that we can say about them that maybe aren't necessarily all in the standard profile information, because we found them out through our big national survey, the Cultural Participation Monitor. So, for example, so just before I start this bit, just to say that often these groups, because they're kind of middle Britain, they often come up on the sort of on the middle of lots of categories. So often when you say, what do people like on average? They come out looking a bit similar to this. That doesn't mean these people aren't as distinct in their own right. They just happen to be less extreme in either direction than many other groups. But they are different in some of these other ways. This is quite a fun one. So Dormitory Dependables, by and large, and most people feel a little bit uncomfortable like being asked to take part in performances. I'm not the only person that sort of cringes slightly when they look for audience participation. But Dormitory Dependables particularly really aren't keen on doing that. Trips and treats are about average. They're also this thing about they like a relatively standard live format. So they are more likely than average to want to go along to see various different art forms in person in a venue and sort of sit there and watch it without taking part. But they're relatively less likely than average to want to do some of that stuff at home via sort of, online screenings or indeed live screenings and cinemas and stuff. Whereas Trips and Treats are much more in line with the average for all of those, despite the fact that they're on average actually participating slightly less than some of the other groups or relative to the population. When it comes to an interest in doing stuff at home, doing stuff online, actually they're slightly in line with the above average. Okay. The Dormitory Dependables are also, when we asked a whole bank of questions, about which there's lots more in other presentations, but we asked people about attitudes to venues taking a stance on climate or taking a stance on social issues. Of all the groups, really, this was the group that was least likely to agree to all of those statements about taking a positive stance. So they're relatively disinclined to get into all that stuff, as they might put it, compared to Trips and Treats being actually relatively average. Trips and Treats, on the other hand, are relatively, I said they're quite digital, they're also relatively likely to want to use their phone for various things. Worth noting that, as with all groups, they don't like the idea of people turning up at events and talking on their phone. No one likes that, particularly in Dormitory Dependables. But for lots of these other sort of types of use of a phone, so using social media, taking photos, taking videos, and so forth, they're substantially above average for those measures. So they're much more likely to want to do that. So again, we're seeing a tendency towards different or more informal or more digital or engagement amongst that group relative to Dormitory Dependables. That said, they're also less likely to come out and say, actually, I'm just not interested in arts and culture. It's not my thing. Don't like it. So 38% say that compared to 32 overall. Dormitory Dependables are barely, outside the margin of error in terms of that difference. So Trips and Treats in particular are not tending to identify themselves as being arty, but possibly worth seeing that in the context that perhaps the arts don't often see themselves as being Trips and Treatsy, and maybe there's a little bit of a kind of bridging that can happen from both directions there, rather than just them coming to us, so to speak. I say them, I'm pretty sure I'm in this segment, but the other thing just in terms of art form tastes is that Trips and Treats are particularly less likely to say that they attend visual arts exhibitions compared to various other art forms in which they're much more kind of, they're much closer to the average. So that might be about some of the styling of visual arts spaces often being quite that kind of metropolitan modernist, white boxy type framing, which is, I think, particularly the strand of culture which pushes the suburbs away a little bit. Again, that's another little theoretical digression we'll leave to one side. but it does feel that there might be something there about, some visual arts organisations are probably much better at being open to these groups than others, and it might be worth looking at who that is and how that works. So that's a little bit of a compare and contrast between these two. There is obviously, loads more that could be said about them, and indeed we have said about them, because we've got summary profiles that tell you about what kinds of things these different groups like, where they go, which art forms, which comms, which messages, and of course we've barely touched on those subtypes that really do make quite a difference, particularly in these quite big middle engaged groups. So I would encourage you to go and look at these resources and how they differentiate when you get to those T1 and T2 groups. That's all available at that address there, so evidence.audienceanswers.org. And then this motivation guide, which kind of presents that and some other information in a nice, easy to digest way. There's mapping that shows you where different groups are located. So this is just showing at the top level that Leeds has more Dormitory Dependables further north and Trips and Treats further south, for example, as well as big swathes of other groups like Commuterland Culturebuffs we touched on, that people who do marketing in the Leeds area will know as kind of big audience hotspots. This same information is publicly available for free for any area of the country. So do go and have a look at your local patch, and then you can zoom in and see all the details of each particular place if you want more. Or you can zoom in much more detail and get the full works in terms of information and demographics and stats and things broken down for as granular as ward level for your local area via a population profile report. These aren't free, but they are, I would think, probably the sort of number one place to start in terms of getting a really close handle on the local audience and how it varies and some of the sort of differences we talked about, how they play out. So that's it from me as a quick run through Suburbia. That makes it sound like I'm doing parkrun, but over to Jackie. What's your thoughts?
Thanks, Ollie. I don't know if you want to address a question or a couple of questions in, or just one question in the chat about the relative sizes of the groups, which we touched on at the beginning of the.
Yes. So in terms of overall size of the groups, Dormitory Dependables is the single largest group, which I think was, so it was on that slide near the beginning. So it was 20% of the population, and Trips and Treats was 13%. So one is a little bit bigger than the other, but still, 13% is quite a substantial chunk. They're not growing particularly as groups in the population, but they are growing as proportions of cultural audiences. There we go.
Lovely.
And then back over to you.
Great. So I find the suburbs absolutely fascinating, both as places and as sort of almost in a philosophical way as well. Not least because of something that we have touched on, which is the way we describe them and the way we think about them. I won't get too philosophical, but there is something that always strikes me in that we tend to refer to some groups as being suburbs, but to other groups as being on the outskirts or the fringes of towns and cities, which I find quite interesting. And I wonder what plays into our use of language when we describe those sorts of places that aren't city centres and aren't the centres of big towns, but are sort of sitting and aren't rural. They're sort of in between. But I think the key thing that occurred to me listening to what Ollie was talking about is that it's definitely a mistake and perhaps a little bit outdated to think of the suburbs as somewhere which is static and homogenous. They are changing, and they're changing quite rapidly, perhaps more rapidly than they have in previous decades. And that might be driven by the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, where a lot of people started to reevaluate where they were living. If they were living in urban centres with perhaps not much outdoor space, that became much more obvious to people when they weren't able to get out and about and doing things, and home was really all they had. So there was definitely, significant numbers of people moving out of urban centres into these more suburban areas. And there's also economic drivers. So as private rents go up in city centres, people are priced out and they move to less expensive suburban areas, and that drives change in those areas, including sort of demographically. So there are people of different ages and life stages, different ethnicities and so on, living in these suburban areas. So you really have to think about who they are and do a little bit of digging into what the suburbs look like in your area, because they do look different in different parts of the country, as Ollie was saying. And so really sort of getting to know them, who they are, what they like, what sort of barriers they might face. So if you're in a city or a town centre venue, and you want to engage audiences living further away from you, you know, if they're reliant on public transport, what does that look like for them? You know, might you need to sort of go out to them in some way if you can? So really thinking about what might stop them from engaging with you. And also there might be, you know, particular segments which are more prominent in your area. So it might be Dormitory Dependables or Trips and Treats. It might equally be Commuterland Culturebuffs or Up Our Street. So really understanding who they are in your area and what it is about you that might appeal to them. Because as Ollie was saying, although we may not think of them as being hugely creative spaces, there is a lot of everyday creativity going on in the suburbs in lots of different ways. So building that understanding is really important, because again, thinking of them as a homogenous group doesn't really do them justice. Each of those segments is quite distinct. They have different needs. And they all offer different things that they might bring to your organisation as well. So, for example, some of them might be more likely to be secondary spend people and spend money in your cafe and your shop, if the offer is right for them. So if your organisation, like many, is struggling with recovery after COVID and with the cost of living crisis, they might offer new revenue streams for you, also through membership or individual giving. So those are all things worth considering. But another thing they all have in common is that they're quite loyal as audiences. So once you have them, they're much more likely to become repeat attenders, maybe not frequently, but you know, you will see them coming in, and that they can also become quite good advocates within their local networks, because for many of these groups, particularly those the family members of these segments, word of mouth is a really strong information source, and they're much more likely, you know, it's quite influential for them, for people within their circles to say, oh yeah, that's a really good place to go. So there's all sorts of things that they can offer you, as well as the things that you can offer them, in terms of their sort of cultural engagement. And I think most importantly, and as Ollie was saying, because they are so widespread across the country, if you want to be truly representative of the communities that you serve, then you have to pay attention to these groups and get to know them and build them into your strategic planning, and perhaps look for opportunities to partner with organisations where they are to kind of bring them closer to you as an organisation, and just really make them feel invited and welcome, and that your space is a space for them. So that's my my two penneth on suburban audiences.
Lovely. Thank you very much. On that last point about sort of making people feel that a space is a space for them, I think one of the points we flagged earlier, particularly with Dormitory Dependables, is the kind of a slightly sort of no nonsense preference for communications. So there's a terrible tendency of people to write, you know, really kind of elaborate, slightly artsy speak about what the particular experience is, and that is actually telling people that this isn't something that wants you there, as opposed to being persuasive, or at least for these groups often. Lovely. Well, I'm going to stop screen sharing so that we can all see each other a little bit better, and we're going to stop recording.